Mike Anderson had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for nearly 15 years, longer than most of his neighbors. He'd seen families come and go, watched children grow up, and weathered the subtle changes in the community with the quiet resilience that had become his trademark. But nothing in those 15 years had prepared him for the spectacle that would unfold on a sweltering Saturday in late August. The above-ground pool in Mike's backyard had been a sanctuary for his family for 7 summers. His children had learned to swim in that pool, neighborhood kids had splashed away countless summer afternoons there, and it had been the centerpiece of more family barbecues than he could count. But the kids were older now, with summer jobs and activities that kept them busy, and the pool had sat largely unused this season. Between the maintenance costs and his wife Sarah's concerns about liability with the neighborhood teens, they'd made the decision. The pool had to go. "It's just not worth it anymore," Mike explained to Sarah as he gathered his tools that Saturday morning. "Besides, we could use the extra yard space for your garden expansion." Sarah smiled appreciatively and handed him a glass of iced tea. "Just be careful taking it down. Do you want to call Kevin to help?" Mike shook his head. "Nah, I got this. Should be straightforward enough." The process began simply enough. Mike drained the remaining water, carefully directing it away from both his and his neighbor's properties into a nearby storm drain. He was methodical, as was his nature, ensuring that every step was done properly to avoid any issues. By mid-morning, he was dismantling the frame, the pieces neatly stacked on his lawn. It was around 11 when he first noticed Deborah Winters watching from her second-story window. The Winters had moved in 2 years ago, and while they weren't unfriendly exactly, they kept mostly to themselves. Mike had tried to be neighborly, inviting them to barbecues, offering to help with yard work, but his efforts had been met with polite refusals. He'd eventually stopped trying, figuring some people just prefer their privacy. Mike waved, but Deborah quickly stepped away from the window. He thought nothing of it and continued with his work. 30 minutes later, as he was removing the last section of the pool liner, he heard the distinctive sound of a car door slamming. Glancing up, he saw Deborah marching across her lawn toward the property line, phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying an edge that immediately put Mike on alert. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Mike straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Taking down my pool? Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," Deborah replied, her voice rising. "You can't just remove structures without proper permits. This is a code violation, and I've already called the police." Mike blinked, momentarily stunned by the absurdity of the accusation. "It's an above-ground pool, Deborah. It's not a permanent structure. I don't need permits to take down my own pool." "That's not for you to decide," she snapped. "There are rules in this neighborhood, and I intend to see they're followed." As if on cue, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing steadily louder. Mike shook his head in disbelief as he realized that this was really happening. His neighbor had actually called the police because he was taking down his own pool. Sarah appeared at the back door, confusion written across her face as she took in the scene. "Mike, what's going on?" Before he could answer, a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 police officers emerged from the cruiser, their expressions professionally neutral as they surveyed the scene. A half-dismantled pool, neatly stacked metal frame pieces, and 2 neighbors clearly in the midst of a dispute. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Officer Reynolds, approached first, while his partner, Officer Chen, hung back slightly, taking in the surroundings with practiced eyes. "Good afternoon, folks," Officer Reynolds said, his tone measured and calm. "We received a call about a possible code violation." Before Mike could speak, Deborah rushed forward, pointing an accusatory finger. "Yes, officer. This man is removing a structure without proper permits. I've been on the annual committee for Oak Ridge Estates, and I know for a fact that all structural changes must be approved beforehand." Mike fought to keep his voice level. "Officers, this is my pool that I purchased and installed myself 7 years ago. It's an above-ground temporary structure, not a permanent installation." Officer Chen had made her way over to examine the pool components. She knelt down to inspect the dismantled frame, then glanced at the empty patch of grass where the pool had previously stood. "Ma'am, he appears to be correct. This looks like a standard above-ground pool kit." "That doesn't matter," Deborah insisted, her cheeks flushing. "The HOA guidelines clearly state." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, stepping into the yard with a folder in hand. "Here are our HOA guidelines. We reviewed them before beginning just to be safe." She flipped to a tabbed page and pointed to a highlighted section. Section 8, Paragraph 3. Temporary recreational equipment, including but not limited to trampolines, above-ground pools, and playground equipment, do not require HOA approval for installation or removal, provided they do not interfere with utility access or violate height restrictions. Officer Reynolds accepted the folder, scanning the text carefully while Deborah shifted uncomfortably. The officer looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. Ma'am, have you actually read these guidelines recently? Of course I have, Deborah snapped. I'm on the committee. Then you might want to review this section, he said, handing the folder back to Sarah, because it clearly states that Mr. Anderson is within his rights to remove his own pool without HOA approval. Deborah's expression hardened. That's just about the HOA. He still needs city permits for. Actually, Officer Chen interjected, the city doesn't require permits for removal of non-permanent structures, such as above-ground pools. I know because my brother-in-law works in the permit office and he's mentioned this specific issue before. For a moment, Deborah stood speechless, her planned argument crumbling before her. Then rallying, she gestured toward the small puddles of water still visible near the storm drain. He's improperly disposing of chemicals. That pool water contains chlorine that's now going into our water system. Mike sighed. I stopped adding chemicals 3 weeks ago when we decided to take it down. I've been testing the water and it's been chlorine-free for over 10 days. I have the test strips inside if you'd like to see them. The officers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. Ma'am, it appears that there isn't actually a violation here. But there must be something, Deborah insisted, her voice rising. He can't just. Actually, Officer Chen said, her tone gentle but firm, he can. This is his property and he's removing his own recreational equipment in accordance with both HOA and city guidelines. Deborah's face flushed deeper, and she opened her mouth to protest further when Officer Reynolds asked, Ma'am, when you called this in, did you report this as an emergency? Well, I wanted a quick response before he damaged anything further. Officer Reynolds' expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. So you use emergency services for a non-emergency situation? Deborah's face paled at Officer Reynolds' question about misusing emergency services. She took a small step backward, suddenly aware of the precarious position she had put herself in. I was concerned about neighborhood safety, she stammered. Water damage can be serious. Officer Chen nodded thoughtfully. Yes, it can be. Which is why Mr. Anderson here has been so careful to direct the water properly to the storm drain, as permitted by city ordinance for residential pools without excessive chemical content. What none of them had noticed during their exchange was that the commotion had attracted attention. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, curious about the police presence on their usually quiet street. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the edges of Mike's property, watching with undisguised interest. What's going on? Asked Tom Fletcher from across the street, approaching with his teenage son in tow. Mike's taking down his pool, and apparently that's a crime now, Sarah replied, loud enough for everyone to hear, her patience clearly wearing thin. Murmurs rippled through the growing audience. Mike noticed several neighbors exchanging knowing glances. You mean Deborah called the cops on you for taking down your own pool? Linda Ramirez asked, incredulity evident in her voice. She turned to her husband. Didn't we take down our daughter's swing set last year? Should we have gotten a permit for that too? Scattered laughter broke out among the neighbors, causing Deborah to cross her arms defensively. This isn't about swing sets, she insisted. It's about property values and neighborhood standards. Standards? Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than Mike, stepped forward. Dear, I've been on the actual architectural review committee for 10 years, and I can assure you that removing an above-ground pool does not require approval. In fact, we encourage it when they're no longer in use. They become eyesores. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation that was rapidly evolving beyond a simple neighbor dispute. Folks, I understand this is interesting neighborhood drama, but I need to ask you all to. Actually, officer, interrupted Kevin Martinez, who lived 2 doors down from Mike, I think you should know that this isn't the first time Deborah has done something like this. The officers exchanged glances. What do you mean? Officer Chen asked. She called code enforcement on the Jacksons for their basketball hoop last summer, offered another neighbor. And she reported my son's garage band for noise violation at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, added Tom Fletcher. They were practicing for the school talent show. Don't forget when she tried to fine the Wilsons for planting non-approved flowers in their own backyard, Linda Ramirez added. Turns out the flowers were on the approved list all along. With each new revelation, Deborah seemed to shrink further into herself, her righteous indignation morphing into visible discomfort. The officers were now looking at her with expressions that mixed professional neutrality with growing skepticism. Mike, who had been quietly observing this unexpected neighborhood tribunal, finally spoke up. Look, I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I just want to finish taking down my pool, which I have every right to do. Officer Reynolds nodded. Mr. Anderson is correct. There's no violation here and we'll be on our way. He turned to Deborah, his tone shifting to something more official. Ma'am, I need to remind you that misuse of emergency services is a serious matter. We have actual emergencies that require our attention." Deborah's face flushed anew, this time with embarrassment rather than anger. "I was just trying to enforce the rules," she said weakly. "Perhaps," Officer Chen suggested gently, "it would be best to check what the rules actually are before calling the authorities next time." As the officers prepared to leave, Mike couldn't help but notice how the neighborhood had literally gathered around him in support. People he barely spoke to beyond casual waves were now standing in his yard, forming an unexpected alliance. It was an odd feeling, this community solidarity that had emerged from such an absurd situation. After the police left, most neighbors lingered, the afternoon's drama having sparked a spontaneous block gathering unlike anything Oak Ridge Estates had seen in years. Someone brought out folding chairs. The Ramirez family returned with a cooler of sodas. Tom Fletcher disappeared briefly and returned with bags of chips. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into an impromptu neighborhood event. Mike, who had initially just wanted to finish his project in peace, found himself at the center of a supportive crowd, many offering to help complete the pool dismantling. Kevin Martinez and two other neighbors were already picking up pieces of the metal frame, organizing them for disposal. "You know," Mrs. Patel said, settling into a lawn chair Sarah had brought out, "this neighborhood used to do things together all the time. Block parties, holiday celebrations. Somehow we lost that over the years." Deborah remained on the periphery, clearly uncomfortable, but seemingly unable to retreat completely. Her husband had joined her, looking confused and embarrassed by the situation he'd walked into. As Mike worked alongside his neighbors to finish dismantling the pool, Officer Reynolds unexpectedly returned. He parked his cruiser and approached the group, causing a momentary hush to fall over the gathering. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his expression serious, "but there's something I think you all should know." He glanced at Deborah, who had gone very still. "Normally, I wouldn't share this, but given the circumstances and the potential for ongoing neighborhood issues, I felt it was important." He pulled out his department tablet and turned it to face the group. "After leaving, I ran a check on calls from this neighborhood. In the past year alone, we've received 17 calls from Ms. Winter's residents reporting alleged violations by neighbors. Everything from noise complaints to parking violations to, well, unauthorized pool removal." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mike looked at Deborah, who was staring at the ground, her husband's expression shifting from embarrassment to shock. 17 calls, he said, turning to his wife. "Deb, you told me you'd only called once or twice about serious issues." Officer Reynolds continued, "None of these calls resulted in actual citations. They were all either unfounded or fell within normal neighborhood activities protected by local ordinances." "What my partner is trying to say," added Officer Chen, who had also returned and joined the group, "is that we have a term for this at the department. We call it weaponizing law enforcement, using police as a tool to harass neighbors over personal grievances." The neighborhood fell silent, all eyes turning toward Deborah, who had begun to tremble slightly. I wasn't," she began, then suddenly her voice broke. "You don't understand what it's like." Her unexpected outburst startled everyone. "Well, what's like, Deborah?" Sarah asked, her tone gentler than Mike would have expected. "Being the outsider. Everyone here has known each other for years. You all have your history, your inside jokes, She gestured vaguely at the impromptu gathering. We moved here wanting to be part of a community, but it felt like breaking into a private club." Mike felt an unexpected pang of empathy, remembering his early attempts to welcome the Winters that had been politely rebuffed. "So your solution was to call the cops on everyone?" Tom Fletcher asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Deborah's husband placed a hand on her shoulder. "Deb, is this true? All these calls?" She wiped at her eyes. "I thought if I could just get everyone to follow the same rules, to meet the same standards, then maybe I'd feel like I belonged." Her voice had grown small. "I know it sounds ridiculous now." There was an uncomfortable silence as everyone processed this unexpected confession. Mike exchanged glances with Sarah, who gave him a subtle nod. "Deborah," Mike said finally, stepping forward. "I invited you and Jim to our barbecues 3 times when you first moved in." "I know," she admitted. "I was intimidated. Everyone seems so close already. I didn't know how to just join in." Mrs. Patel shook her head. "My dear, you don't join a community by trying to control it. You join by participating in it." Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. "Well, this has taken an unexpected turn. I just wanted to make everyone aware of the situation. But I should note, continued misuse of emergency services can result in fines." 2 weeks after what the neighborhood had come to call the pool incident, Oak Ridge Estates was experiencing something of a renaissance. The spontaneous gathering in Mike's yard had sparked conversations that continued long after the last pieces of the pool had been hauled away. Old connections were renewed and new ones formed as neighbors recognized how isolated they had become from one another over the years. Mike stood in his backyard, surveying the space where the pool had once stood. Sarah was already sketching plans for an expanded garden, but today he was focused on preparing the area for something else entirely. Kevin and Tom were helping him set up folding tables in a large U shape, while Linda Ramirez directed a group arranging chairs. "You sure about this?" Kevin asked, adjusting a table. "After everything that happened?" Mike nodded. "Actually, it was Sarah's idea. Said it was the perfect icebreaker." A sound of car doors slamming announced new arrivals. Mike looked up to see the Winters, Deborah and Jim, standing hesitantly at the side gate, a covered dish in Jim's hands. After Officer Reynolds' revelation and Deborah's emotional confession, the neighborhood had dispersed in an awkward silence. Mike had spent that evening in quiet conversation with Sarah, processing the day's events. "Maybe she's right," Sarah had said. "Have we really been as welcoming as we think?" The following day, Mike had crossed the yard to the Winters' house and knocked on their door. The conversation had been uncomfortable at first, but essential. Jim had apologized profusely for his wife's actions. Deborah, though clearly humiliated, had managed to express genuine remorse. "We'd like you to come," Mike said, now approaching the hesitant couple. "It wouldn't be a proper block party without everyone." Deborah's eyes widened. "Even after I nearly had you arrested for dismantling your own pool?" "Especially after that," Mike replied with a slight smile. "It turns out you did exactly what the neighborhood needed. You got us all talking again." The early awkwardness dissolved as more neighbors arrived, each bringing food and drinks to share. Mrs. Patel had unearthed old photo albums showing neighborhood events from years past. Children who normally stayed indoors playing video games were running through sprinklers in adjacent yards. Even Officers Reynolds and Chen made an appearance during their patrol, accepting plates of food with good-natured thanks. "I can't believe this is happening," Deborah said quietly to Sarah as they stood by the dessert table later that afternoon. "I was sure everyone would hate me forever." Sarah handed her a serving spoon. "Communities are more forgiving than you might think, especially when someone is willing to admit they made a mistake. Besides," she added with a laugh, "you've given us the best neighborhood story since the Hendersons' escaped pet snake incident of 2018. As evening approached, Mike found himself sitting next to Jim Winters, both men watching as their neighbors chatted in groups across the yard. "You know," Jim said, "when Deb told me she'd called the cops on you for taking down your pool, I thought she finally lost it. Never imagined it would lead to this." He gestured at the gathering. Mike nodded. "Neither did I. But I guess sometimes it takes something absurd to make you realize what's important." Across the yard, Mike spotted Officer Reynolds chatting with several neighbors. Catching Mike's eye, the officer raised his cup in a civil toast. The true punchline of the pool incident, as the neighborhood now referred to it, wasn't just the absurdity of Deborah calling the police over a dismantled pool or the officer's incredulous reactions. The real punchline was how a moment that should have driven the community further apart had somehow managed to bring them all closer together. The newly empty space where the pool had once stood was now serving a different purpose, not as a gathering place for just the Anderson family, but as the center of a revitalized neighborhood community. And as Mike looked around at the faces of neighbors who had once been strangers despite years of proximity, he realized that sometimes the most unexpected conflicts lead to the most valuable resolutions. The following week, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA meeting had record attendance. The first item on the agenda proposed by Mrs. Patel and seconded by Deborah Winters herself. A monthly neighborhood gathering, rotating from home to home. The motion passed unanimously.